Welcome to my economics channel, where I love discussing the subject, but most importantly, I love to make something fun and interesting to learn. And to that end, I have a little bit of a sad video today because it's on one of my favorite Australian YouTubers, FriendlyJordies, and how he's actually trying to attack the Liberal Party for helping raise or putting in place policies over the past 10 or 11 years that have helped raise house prices in Australia, and in particular the past few years, and in particular, of course, in the past 12 months, where he shows statistics, the house prices have gone up 24%. So I say sad because his political commentary is amazing and he brings lots of evidence to the fore. However, his economic videos, or the videos where he touches on economics, are not very good. And this video is no exception. And there are lots of claims made in the video about the Liberal Party and its policies over the past 10 or 11 years and how they have negatively affected the Australian housing market. However, the vast majority of these are wrong and they simply don't hold up to any sort of scrutiny or simply any of the data that we see. So I have absolutely no love for the Liberal Party, if for nothing else than their disastrous environmental policies and the fact that we're not catching up to the world in terms of renewable energy. And there's still quite a lot of climate change denial at the federal level, which could have lasting damage and lasting impact, a negative impact on the Australian economy. Because some of these claims are so easily debunked, but they are easily believable, they actually damage real criticisms against the government. And so in regards to the Australian housing market, I want to show what we can criticize the Liberal Party for and what we can't criticize the Liberal Party for. And spoiler alert, there's not a whole lot that we can specifically criticize the Liberal Party for regarding the Australian market. But without any further ado, let's get into the very first claim he makes, and I hope you enjoy this soothing B-roll.
Listening to that man's off-the-cuff views on housing, it does make a lot of sense why the Liberals have stuffed up the housing market this much in the last decade, and we're going to get to that.
And so what FriendlyJordies is referring to here is that the Prime Minister recently made a remark, a very regrettable remark, whereby he said people who are struggling to rent should just simply buy their houses instead. So obviously this is nonsense because there are pros and cons to purchasing a house and there are also pros and cons to renting a house. And you have to choose which one you want depending on your own financial situation and where you are in life. However, when FriendlyJordies claims that the Liberal Party stuffed up their housing market in particular, this is what we see actually around the world in all advanced economies. We see a huge spike in house prices roughly similar times. And in particular, we see large spikes in the past 2 years due to the COVID recession. And so, of course, he puts the vast majority of the blame on the Liberal Party up front to help color your own views and to help set the tone for his own video. But we know better than that, and we're going to continue going into his next claim.
You know where that extra 2 million came in, where you thought, okay, you're just bayoneting a corpse at this point? Last year, when prices went up across the country by a quarter in 12 months. That is no accident. Over the last decade, the Liberals have done everything they can to make housing prices skyrocket and your wages to stay stagnant.
And so here we have two separate claims. We have the fact that Liberal policies have specifically led to house prices in Australia go up by 24% in the past 12 months, and that your wages have stagnated. Whilst indeed it is true that real wages in Australia have actually decreased, or at the very least the rate of growth over the past 5 or so years has actually decreased, this is not entirely down to just policies set in place by the Liberal Party. A big part of that story is the productivity slowdown. And this is not something that can be simply mandated by one party. If the Labor Party was in power, a very similar story would have played out. The other thing is that one of the big stories around COVID, around the advanced economies around the world, is that people had a lot more money because of government stimulus, and a lot of it went into housing. In particular, because of the work from home policies, people were moving out from the center of cities and moving into suburbs. All of a sudden, you didn't have to live close to work. All of a sudden, you could live further out. You could be 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 kilometers out. And typically those houses would have been cheaper by virtue of the fact that they're so far away from all of the amenities of the city and of course your job. And because people expected the pandemic to last a longer time, this is what helped spur those purchasing decisions out in the suburbs. And so it pushed up prices out in the suburbs. All of these factors played into virtually every advanced economy around the world. All of these factors came together to push up house prices for houses in suburbia, whereas previously that didn't happen. And so that's not just down to the Liberal Party flicking a switch or inadvertently because of policies they've said in the past. It was almost entirely out of their control. And so because of a sudden change in preference, and I do mean sudden, it came about because of the coronavirus pandemic and all the shutdowns associated with it. Because of these change in preferences and because people had more money, they went out into the suburbs. And so the point being, if this phenomenon was particular to Australia, then it would be worth investigating and it might be worth pinning this on the Liberal Party. But as it stands, it's not. And just to finish off with, in terms of real wage growth, a lot of advanced economies around the world have experienced slowdowns in real wage growth. And a lot of this is attributable to the slowdown in total factor productivity. Now, this could be a video of it on its own because there's a lot to this, but a lot of advanced economies are experiencing this drop in total factor productivity. And worker productivity is one of the big things that helps determine your wage. So if this drops, your real wage will also most likely drop. But this is not something that can be simply fixed by a new law or by different policies. It's much, much bigger than that. And it's certainly a much bigger issue than what FriendlyJordies gives it credit for.
Previous 10 years, majority held by Labor, Sydney housing prices grew 31%, wages went up 41%. Last 10 years, exclusively held by the Libs, housing prices went up 105% and your wages went up 18%. That is no accident.
Now, of course, notwithstanding the last part where it says this is not an accident and that we want house prices to continue going up, what happened the last time house prices dropped? This actually happened during 2007 and 2008. And yes, there were 10 or 20% drops in house prices in many major economies around the world, including Australia. And what was the result? It was a global financial crisis. In general, house prices going down is generally not a good sign. One of the reasons for this is that the vast majority of Australians' wealth, and indeed, in most advanced economies around the world, the vast majority of people's wealth is held in housing. So when house prices go up, your wealth increases. Your balance sheet as a family or as an individual is looking better because the value of your assets, the price of your assets has actually increased. Now, of course, you can look at this another way. If you owned a stock and you bought it for $100, would you want the price to drop down to $80? Of course not. You would consider that as a bad sign, and you might in fact think that is a good time to sell. And in fact, that is one of the things that happened during the global financial crisis. As house prices plunged, there was a lot of selling activity which put further downward pressure on house prices. But the thing is, in general, governments and central banks do not want house prices to drop. Now, indeed, it could be the case that the Liberal Party has put in policies in the past 10 years that have directly led or that have indirectly led to the rise in house prices that we've seen, and in particular in the past few years. However, they are serving a large constituency, which is homeowners. Homeowners as a block, in general, do not want to see house prices go down because that's the value of their assets. That's their net worth going down. And so if such policies exist, and I don't doubt that they do, the vast majority of homeowners implicitly or explicitly support them because it supports their own balance sheets, their own net worth. And by extension, people by and large still consider housing to be a good investment. And that's exactly what they see it as, an investment. The problem, of course, with housing is that that is where people live. It's different from a stock, which you can just buy or sell. And you can't live in a stock and you can't eat a stock. But the housing and the stock market are very similar in that we want prices for both to increase. If the vast majority of people were happy to hold the vast majority of their wealth either in stocks or bonds or some other similar financial instrument, then maybe people could accept the prices of houses going down. But as it is, that is simply not acceptable to the vast majority of people. And it's also not acceptable to renters who are aspiring to become homeowners, who want to join the fray and see their own net worth grow over time.
I know what we'll do. We'll compile a Senate report about why housing prices are mysteriously exploding every time we're in government. And what's the conclusion of this government that's completely bought and sold by property developers? I know what we're going to do. We're going to loosen restrictions on property developers even more. That'll solve the problem because it's a supply issue. It's always a supply issue. Every time housing is brought up, the Liberals say it's because there's not enough cardboard box apartments in Sydney. That's the problem. So we need to loosen regulation even further on property developers that build houses.
Okay, so this is a particular bugbear of mine. Now, in terms of regulations, I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about. However, if we're allowing more housing to be built, this is ultimately a good thing. Once again, in most advanced economies around the world, one of the big factors that is leading to the rise in house prices is the fact that there is a shortage, especially with the rise of NIMBYism, where people will have a lot of land in a suburb, they'll put a house on it, or they'll buy a house already on the piece of land, and they don't want much development or any development around them because specifically this could drive down the value of their own home. And of course, politicians listen to their constituents, and that in part helps form policy. And so if there are policy changes or zoning changes which can help build more houses, this will drive down house price increases and make housing more affordable in the long run. Restricting housing or making it harder to build more housing or more apartments is only going to drive up housing prices in the long run, which only favors the property owning class. Now, the other part that annoys me is when he's disparaging the construction of new apartments. Now, I've heard arguments on all sides, and all of these arguments cannot possibly be true at the same time. So the first one is that we don't build enough housing. Fair enough, that's one argument. The other argument is that we build too many apartments. And the other argument is that apartment prices are too high. And so which one is it? If there are too many apartments, how are prices still too high? Clearly, we still don't have enough apartments being built in Canberra and other places around the world. And if there are not enough houses and house prices are too high, clearly building more houses is going to help in the long run drive down house prices, or at the very least drive down the increases that we've seen in house prices.
Everyone else realised, okay, you're supposed to give the public money during times of recession so you can keep the economy moving. Our government's immediate instinct was, you know who doesn't have enough money? The big four banks. They gave them virtually unlimited cheap credit. That got handed out in the form of mortgages. That caused housing prices to explode in a year. That's why you had 25% growth. That means that a bunch of people are getting those mortgages on the idea that interest rates are going to remain low for the rest of their lives. They're not. There's probably going to be an interest rate spike at the end of this year, and then people with these massive mortgages will have to default, i.e. exactly what happened to trigger the global financial crisis.
Now here we have a really bizarre point in the video. We have two competing claims. So here FriendlyJordies wants to have his cake and eat it too. On the one hand, we have stimulus enacted by the Liberal Party to help support people build up their savings, and ultimately a large portion of those savings helped fuel the house price increases that we've seen over the past few years. But on the other hand, it also wasn't enough. You've got to imagine that if it was even bigger, we would then see that funneled into even bigger increase in house prices. It is actually true that amongst the advanced economies around the world, as a percentage of GDP, the stimulus enacted by the Liberal Party was actually one of the lowest. Now, it might have been well targeted, it might have been well enacted, and all of these other things. But the fact remains, there was actually, as a percentage of GDP, one of the lowest of advanced economies. So the fact that we've seen house price increases similar to other advanced economies around the world, whereas our stimulus was actually smaller than other advanced economies around the world, well, that cannot possibly be the largest contributing factor to house prices. There must be other factors at play. Now, to really make this point again, at the start of the video, he said that Liberal Party policies have directly led to the really large increases on house prices on the one hand, but on the other hand, supposedly the biggest factor that should have led to house price increases was actually smaller than in other advanced economies around the world. And so the two don't match. They can't possibly be true at the same time. There must be something outside of Liberal Party policies, which is helping fuel Australian house prices. Now, the final point, and he also further mentions this elsewhere in the video, where he says that interest rates have been deliberately driven down by what he calls the independent central bank and by the Liberal Party colluding to drive down interest rates and help fuel sort of an unsustainable growth in credit, money, people's savings, and ultimately the prices of houses. So we have this story whereby the Liberals want to drive up house prices because this presumably helps their constituents, and they colluded or collaborated with the RBA, or the RBA acted on its own, whichever is the case, and they drove down interest rates to directly affect house prices. Now, one of the problems behind this is that it gives a lot of power to the RBA, and indeed to any central bank. Central banks do indeed control the nominal rate of an overnight interest or very short interest rate durations, not 5, 10, 15, 20% interest rates. Central banks might fantasize about controlling those interest rates, but ultimately those are set by the market. So the fact is that the central bank can control nominal interest rates. You would have seen in Russia that the central bank raised its interest rate to 20% virtually overnight. In fact, I think it was overnight. However, the real interest rate could actually be negative if, let's say, inflation is running at 50%. And so the point is that the RBA controls the nominal interest rate, but not the real interest rate. And in fact, over the past 2 centuries, and indeed especially in the past few decades, in all advanced economies around the world, it is not as simple as the RBA just choosing an interest rate and then leaving it at that, or the RBA raising interest rate and lowering house prices, or lowering interest rates and raising house prices. The RBA must listen to the economy and adjust interest rates accordingly. In fact, one of the big things behind the global financial crisis, in particular in America with the Fed, is that one of the big contributing factors to what exacerbated the crisis was that early on, even as the Federal Reserve was dropping its nominal interest rate, as compared to market rates at the time, it was still too high. It didn't drop interest rates fast enough. And this exacerbated the problems in the economy. And so even as nominal interest rates were being cut by the Federal Reserve, the market rate, the real interest rate, was actually lower. And so money was actually too tight. Federal Reserve policy was too tight, and this impacted people's access to credit, whereas the economy needed the price of credit to be lower. It was actually too high during that period. And so this is actually one of the reasons why interest rates were cut so fast for economies around the world. And Australia was no exception in that regard. The RBA very quickly cut its interest rates down to near zero. Now, one of the points about low interest rate is that yes, they do help fuel higher house prices. It makes credit cheaper, makes it easier for people to borrow. It possibly leads to malinvestment or investment that wouldn't happen otherwise. And quite a lot of that investment could indeed be bad. And quite a lot of that investment could go into housing. However, on the other hand, the market interest rate dropping to near zero means that that is all the economy can handle. The economy cannot handle higher interest rates. And so the RBA's rate, and indeed other nations around the world, their interest rates, their nominal interest rates, must be low to help accommodate what the economy needs, what it needs right now. And so the fact that the interest rates could be rising as soon as the end of the year, or maybe even earlier, could in fact be a good sign. It could be the sign that the economy is growing, it could be heating up, and we need higher interest rates to help curb some activity and hopefully help curb some, bad or malinvestment. Now, the point is that if low interest rates help people get houses at a higher price than they otherwise would get, and this ultimately is helping fuel the inflation, the high house prices that we're seeing in the past few years, then higher interest rates will help curtail that. It'll help drive it into reverse. The point being that higher interest rates will push up mortgage rates and raise mortgage repayments. And therefore, people won't be able to afford the really high prices. And if this story is true, house prices will eventually drop. Or at the very least, the prices of houses will moderate. The increase will moderate to a much more normal level, one that's more in line with historical norms. And therefore, it might be more sustainable and might make housing more affordable to a larger segment of the population. In that sense, the interest rate increases that we might see could be a good sign. But the point here is that we can't judge the stance of monetary policy by the RBA or the fiscal policies by the Liberal Party just based on the interest rate alone. Interest rates being high could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing, and interest rates being low could be a good thing or could be a bad thing. You've got to remember that whilst high interest rates might slow down house prices increases, it will also make credit harder to get. It could make things in the economy much more expensive in general. And indeed, higher nominal interest rates could slow down activity in Australia at exactly the wrong time. All right, so this is me from the future. As I was editing the final part of the video, which had just a few minutes to go, the audio, for whatever reason, crapped itself and it was completely unusable. And so, as I was saying, if the RBA sets interest rates too high or raises interest rates too quickly as compared to what the market expects or what the market wants, then this could cause pain for at least another generation going forward. As we saw with the global financial crisis, if central banks do not act in a timely manner, if they're not reactive and they're not active in the market, if they're not listening to the market, then this can indeed cause pain. And in fact, one of the big ideas, one of the big theories we have about the slow recovery from the global financial crisis is that the Fed and other central banks around the world didn't act fast enough. And so, as I mentioned, this was the reason, or at least one of the reasons why central banks, including the RBA, dropped interest rates so quickly when it came to this crisis. And so going forward, we expect there to be higher interest rates in the economy. However, how high interest rates should go in the future will ultimately depend on the economy, on the Australian economy, on the market, and what interest rates it needs to function properly going forward. And if the RBA does not listen and does not set its own policy rate, its overnight interest rate, the nominal rate, if it does not set that interest rate accordingly, then we could be in for a lot of pain going forward. It's not enough for the RBA to simply raise rates or lower rates on its own. There's a lot of other work that goes into the process. Now, finally, we might ask ourselves the question, is it foreigners that are helping drive up house prices? Now, to cut a long story short, the answer is no, that foreigners are not meaningfully driving up house prices. In fact, house sales to foreigners over the past few years have actually declined for various reasons. And so it is not a simple fact, it is not a simple narrative that, all of these rich foreigners are coming down to park their money in Australian real estate. It might be that rich foreigners are doing this in other countries around the world and are meaningfully contributing to higher house prices, for example, like in Canada. However, here in Australia, the evidence simply says this is not the case. The reason I bring this up is that it's so tantalizing. It's so easy to believe that, you have people who are struggling in Australia, they're struggling to buy a house, and then all of a sudden these foreigners were allowing them to come in with their, millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, and they can buy, any house they want, or they can easily outbid people, or whatever is the case. And then it's all of this extra demand, whereas, supply is not keeping up, or there's simply just not enough housing to go around, and then we get house price increases. However, as I've already mentioned, this is simply not the case. And we can dismiss this theory on why house prices are going up. However, even though the evidence destroys this argument that is very easy to believe, it does also put the onus back on us. This is an Australian market issue, not just foreigners coming in and, ruining our real estate market. The point is that this is an Australian problem that we ourselves must solve. And so that is the end of my video. I hope what I've shown in my video is that the story laid out by FriendlyJordies trying to connect house price increases directly or very closely to the Liberal Party can simply be dismissed out of hand, at least for the most part. Because these claims are so easily disproven, as I've shown in my own video, they damage real criticisms that we have against the Liberal Party. If a meaningful number of people start parroting the criticisms that he made in his video, and because they're so easily dismissed, the Liberal Party could use that as a defense and then deflect the real criticisms that we should be leveling at the Liberal Party. And so other than pointing out that the economics shown in FriendlyJordies' video is wrong, that is ultimately another point of this video, that I want to show the truth of the situation and ultimately help shine a light on the real criticisms that we should be leveling against the Liberal Party. But that's the end of my video. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask below and I'll do my best to answer, or at the very least I'll collect the questions and answer them in a follow-up video. Otherwise, I really hope you'll subscribe and share my videos, help me reach a wider audience and eventually make money, which is obviously good for me, but also help spread better economics to more people. But thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.